Welcome everyone to a webinar about how to rent out your home in the Netherlands. Hope you are all well and that you can all hear me and are ready for some information about renting a property in the Netherlands. Today's content will be a little bit more about us, Expat Letting Network, our process, renting versus selling, also the rules and regulations, very, very important, and the ideal tenant. We have a little bit about the latest news because there's some new rules and regulations that have been introduced in 2023, and we anticipate some new regulations as well to be introduced in 2024. So we'll discuss those a little bit. We'll talk about the contract types, very important, and the responsibilities for you as a landlord. And then, of course, if there's any room for if there's time for questions, please do let me know. Pop them in the Q&A. Like I mentioned, there's a little Q&A section. Pop the question there because then I can actually start answering them. But maybe let's introduce ourselves first. My name is Kimo Paula. I'm the founder of Expat Letting Network and Expat Housing Network. We are a company that's helped by now thousands of people find a home, and a little bit over a year and a half ago, we started actually renting out properties for landlords as well, and I've been successfully doing so. Today, joining me are my colleague Lilette and Giovanna. I think Giovanna is maybe in the car on her way to an actual viewing, and Lilette is online somewhere, probably accessible to the Q&A, so she'll be able to answer some of the questions. If not, Lilette, let me know, and I'll answer them at the end of the presentation. For everyone that just joined, we'll have the presentation first, and we'll have the Q&A section at the end. So what is the difference between us and other property owners or property managers or realtors is that we actually care. So we came from the world of tenants and we understood what it's like to kind of like find a home for somebody. And we also had exposures to a lot of landlords and a lot of real estate agents. And the process was not always a pleasant one. And we believe that if you make sure that the process is a pleasant one from the landlord and from the realtor side, then the tenant will also appreciate it more and will stay longer in the property. Because in the end, we will all be looking for tenants who stay as long as possible and who take care of the property like it was their own. So there's a couple of things that we focused on. We focus on the experience. It's not a transaction, it's an actual experience. So we tend to make the tenant feel at home from the start and also make sure that you understand everything about the process, all the questions are answered, and you feel like you're catered to as best as possible. Transparent pricing. So we have transparent pricing. We charge 1 month of rent for finding a tenant, and we charge 5% of the monthly rent for managing your property. Then we always look for quality tenants, right? We believe in longevity, in sustainability, and making sure that we find the right candidate for you that will stay, or that you can actually have the option to stay in case you're happy with the tenant, is super, super important for us. And then the last one is continuous support. So for us, the support only starts, or not only starts, but most likely starts when the tenant has moved in, because that's when kind of like the bulk of the work also starts for the property management stuff. And again, we're looking for sustainability here. So we want to make sure that you're happy with your tenant, the tenant is happy with you and with the property. And then there's a long lasting, well, not a marriage, but a long lasting relationship there. Where do we operate? Oh, we operate all over the Netherlands. So we're in Amsterdam, in Den Haag and Rotterdam. We are also in Eindhoven and in Groningen. So if you have a property anywhere in these cities, we're happy to help out. I'm just very curious. Maybe you can pop it in the chat. Where are you looking to rent out your property? And just put the city in the chat. And I'm curious to see who we have. Delft. Well, that's not too far from The Hague and Rotterdam. Groningen. Perfect. That's wonderful. Do I see some more cities pop up? No, we'll see. No worries. Wassenaar also is not too far away from Amsterdam, so that's great. Utrecht, yeah, also relatively close by, so we will be able to accommodate. Wonderful. That is good to know. Thanks a lot for sharing, everyone. Then, how does it work? Or how does the process work? Well, we offer an end-to-end process, right? And we start off with an intake and inventory. It's very important for us to get to know you and to get to know your property. Sometimes we are in love with the landlord, but then the property is just not very well maintained. And there's a lot of things that need to be done before we can be rented out. Sometimes it's the other way around. We get a property sent to us by a landlord and we love the property, but it turns out the landlord is maybe not the type of landlord that we'd like to work with. The most important thing for us is that we believe everyone deserves to feel at home. So every now and then we face kind of like landlords who are a little bit kind of like exclusive and not very inclusive when it comes to the type of tenant that they're looking for. So for us, that is a no-go. So the intake is super important. We also want to make sure that you get to know us, right? Because in the end, we'll be helping you find a tenant and we'll be helping you with your property management in case you would like that. And again, it's going to be a sustainable and long-term relationship. So we want to make good, we want to make sure that it's at a good start and starts well. Then once we've kind of like taken into account your property, we'll actually take photos, we'll list it, we'll promote it as well in our network. And then, of course, we'll start with the viewings, right? So we'll screen the tenants. We'll screen the tenants before they actually come to a viewing to make sure that they actually are eligible for the property. And then we are there to actually show them the property and already build a little bit of a relationship with them, because that's when it starts, right? Every contact point is a moment to start building that relationship, whether it's with you or whether it's with the tenants. Super, super important. And then, of course, we inform them what they would need to do to submit an offer in case they would like to move forward. We will draft the contract. This is something that we'll review with you prior to actually starting the tenant process. So you will see the contract prior to that so that the process can move a little bit faster once the tenant is interested. And then the contract is signed, and then we'll be there for the check-in and the handover, making sure that the tenant knows what the property is like and that there's an inspection report as well. So that is a very important part, because at the end of the tenancy, the inspection report is leading when it comes to what the condition is that the tenant actually delivers the property back in and whether we need to take part of that deposit away or not. And then, of course, the property management starts, right? So we'll be the contact point, especially if you don't want any hassle of the property, then I would definitely suggest this. If you are perfectly fine to do manage it yourself, or maybe you have a family or friend member who can actually manage it, that is perfectly fine as well. What we've experienced is that it's nice to have one point of contact for the tenants to actually reach out to in case there is something up with the property. We will manage vendors, we will manage the process, we will manage the actual contact with the tenants, so you don't have to work on anything. Of course, we'll also manage the rental income, right? So we make sure that the rent is paid in time, and then we chase the tenant in case he is or she is late. Now, that is a little bit more about the service. I don't want to talk too much about ELN because there's a lot of other stuff to talk about. First, let's start off with the pros and cons of renting versus selling. So when it comes to actually buying or selling a property, the pros of that is, of course, you end up with some capital, right? The other pro is that there's no capital gains tax. So if you've made a profit on your property, you don't have to pay taxes over that. Plus, you don't have any more maintenance, right? So you don't have to maintain your property anymore. However, the con is that if it's a cooling market, then maybe you won't be able to get as much for the property as you would have liked, right? Then if you do make a profit, then the wealth tax starts kicking in. And of course, there's no passive income, right? So passive, of course, is between brackets because it's not always passive, right? But you'd have to start doing something with that capital. Now, if you would like to rent out your property, then of course you have the passive income part, right? So you'll get actually a tenant who will pay off the mortgage. You will also be able to bridge a cooling market right now. And right now, for example, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a cooling market, right? Because prices are still higher than they were like a couple of years ago. So it's still a decent market, but we're seeing that maybe realism is creeping back into the market a little bit. Like the Corona effect is wearing off a little bit, and there's a small correction that we're seeing in the property market. Also, you'll actually build up equity because your mortgage will be paid off by the tenant. The cons, of course, is maintenance and responsibilities, but that's something you can outsource. And the mortgage rebate scheme, which is an important one, is that if you own your property and you're living in your property, currently you have the mortgage interest deduction scheme, right? So what you can do is you can deduct the interest that you pay of the mortgage off your taxable income. That actually means that you'll get about like 20 to 30% of the mortgage interest that you pay back, which is great. But you don't have that anymore when you start renting out your property. Also, there's something called tenancy protection. That doesn't have to be necessarily a negative thing, right? But tenants are pretty well protected. So let's say you have a tenant in there that can stay for indefinite, and at 3, 4, or 5 years from now, you would love to sell the property, right? Then you would have to have a good case to actually evict the tenant. Again, this is not necessarily a negative thing, right? If you build up a really good relationship with your tenant, or you only work with temporary contracts, those could be solutions for that. Again, if I talk too fast, speak too fast, don't hesitate to let me know. Also, if there's any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. Now, rules and regulations, the most important thing. Let's start off with the rules and regulations. What are some of the things that we'll discuss? So would you need approval from anyone? What is regulated versus deregulated? Is a housing permit required or not? And do you need a sharing permit? let's start with the approval part, right? So let's say you want to actually rent out your house. You live in it for yourself for like the last 5 or 10 years. Then the first thing you need to do is ask your mortgage provider for approval because they technically own your home. So approval is required, right? Somewhere in the mortgage deed, there's like a clause that states that you cannot rent it out without permission from the mortgage provider. Why is that the case? Well, the case is that, first of all, tenants are very well protected in the Netherlands, and the value of the property when it's rented out is lower than the value was when you're living in it. Why? Well, the most logical reason is, well, there's actually two reasons. One is that you'll be able to sell it to less people, right? If there's a tenant in there, that is protected because only people that want to buy it as an investment will be able to buy it. Second of all, is that the tenant is not kind of like treating the property as the owner would, right? So the maintenance of the property could have an impact on the value of the property. So that's why the value of the property is a little bit lower when a property is rented out. And then if something were to happen and the mortgage provider would have to foreclose or you'd have to sell, right? Then you probably would be able to get less money for it than when you would actually live in it yourself and then sell it. So there's a risk involved there for a mortgage provider, and that's why they always say, okay, we need to give you approval. Now, there's two reasons, or there's two ways, right? One is just to go out there and say, okay, hey, like we want to rent out our property and we want to get approval. And the first thing that the mortgage provider will ask you is, okay, hey, how long are you going to rent out your property? Because if it's just for a year, then they might consider it. However, there will be very strict requirements around what the type of contract is that you can give your tenant. It has to be type of contract that is temporary and it has to have specific clauses in there. Now, if you say I'm going to like live somewhere else indefinitely, right, and I want to rent it out indefinitely, then most likely the bank will not give you permission to rent out the property with your current mortgage, because currently you have a residential mortgage, and most likely they will ask you to change your mortgage into a buy-to-let mortgage or a investment mortgage in this case. There are like ups and downs or like pros and cons to the investment mortgage. The interest rate is a little bit higher, but you do have approval to actually rent it out. Now, that is when it comes to the bank. Then the owners association, let's say you buy an apartment, right? And your apartment is part of a bigger association of owners, then you would also need to actually get sometimes approval from them. Check the bylaws, right? In the bylaws, it often states if you're allowed to just rent it out without approval, or you have to get approval from the owner association. So that is very important. By the way, there's not that many questions that are being asked, so I might as well just like answer some of them already. I got a question from Peter. If your mortgage is paid off, do you still need approval even if it's not removed from the cadastre? That's a good question, Peter. If your mortgage is paid off, then no, that is not the case anymore, because technically the bank or the mortgage provider only owns your property up until you've paid off the mortgage. So as soon as that happens, technically the mortgage deed dissolves, right? So you wouldn't have to worry about any of the clauses there anymore. So you don't need approval then. And good for you if you manage to pay off your mortgage. Now, regulated versus deregulated, very, very, very important. Why? Because this will have an impact on the actual price that you can charge for your property. Okay, let's take a property that is 100 square meters, right? And it's in a specific city. And what happens is that in order for you to define what the rental price is, you first need to figure out whether it's a regulated or a deregulated property. A regulated property is a property where the government has said that this property can have a maximum price. And currently the maximum price is, I believe 808 euros 06, that should be. And that means that if your property is, well, no, let me rephrase that. How do you know if your property is regulated? You know by actually counting the amount of points that are attributed to your property. Okay, how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of things, right? There's a calculation, and size is an important one. The WOZ value is also an important one. WOZ value is the value that's attributed to your property by the government. It's always a year late, right? So it might not be super accurate or it might be off way, but either way, like that will count towards the point system of your property. Then energy sufficiency is also one. Luxury is also one. And then what happens is that based on all these things, and there's actually a calculator online, you can calculate the amount of points you have. By the way, the calculator is not 100% accurate, so I would advise to have a specialist do that. Then you calculate the amount of points that your property has. If your property is anywhere up to 149 points, I think it's up to and including 149 points, then it means it's in the regulated rental sector. That means that you can charge no more than 808 euros and 6 cents for the property as base rent. Of course, on top of that, you can charge for fixtures, you can charge for utilities and so on. So you can still end up having kind of like a monthly rental amount of 1,000, 11, 1,200 euros. But the base rent cannot be more than 808 euros. Okay, now what happens if you manage to get 150 points or 160 points? For now, you can then charge whatever you want, right? There's no kind of like mid segment. So it's kind of like either it's 808 euros or lower, because let's say you get 120 points, then you cannot charge 808 euros. Then it's actually close to 720 or 680 euros. So there is kind of like a value related to the point system below 149. But if you get above that, then boom, you can actually decide whatever you want. So that is good to be mindful of. Now, what if you need a housing permit? This is an interesting one. This differs per municipality. So in Amsterdam, it's different than in The Hague, and in The Hague, it might be different than in Eindhoven. Sometimes most of the time, this permit actually is related to the tenant, right? Because they require a permit to live in the rental property. Why is that? To protect properties for the right tenants. This has much more to do with kind of like the salary cap, right? So let's say it's a regulated rental property, then maybe the government or the local government or the municipality doesn't want anyone that earns 100K to actually rent out a property that is, or to rent a property that is 700 euros. So what do? Is they actually look at it per city. So for Amsterdam, it's only for regulated rental properties, or in case the ground lease or private agreements in there dictate a maximum rent of a certain amount. I don't think you'll face that second case, but if you do face the first case, then please be mindful of it. The Hague, this says, okay, the rental property is 185 points or less. If the price property is 1,000 euros or less, then they can have actually these requests to actually get a housing permit. Then the tenant would need to get a housing permit. However, you can't just say, okay, it's your responsibility as a tenant. If you don't do it, it's your fault, right? As a landlord, you can also get fined if the tenant doesn't have a tenant or housing permit. So it's good to actually include this in the rental contract. Well, in Eindhoven, it's different. The Eindhoven case is only for properties owned by corporations. So it's good to be mindful of that. I see a lot of people that have joined actually since I started. So maybe good to let you know that this presentation will be recorded and shared with you. If you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A, and then either me or my colleague Lilith can actually answer them. Now, a sharing permit. That this differs per municipality as well. Maybe good for you to understand is that if more than two people that don't belong to the same household live in your property, then you would have to get a sharing permit. Give you an example. One of my colleagues actually was sharing a property in Amsterdam, and at some point he wanted his girlfriend to actually move in with him. Well, if he was sharing, then technically he was sharing with somebody that was not family or was not part of his household. So when his girlfriend moved in, they would actually require, or they would need, a sharing permit. In this case, it's the landlord that requires that. It's not something that the tenant has to be responsible for. So please be mindful of that. Maybe good to know is that the requirements for getting approval for permits are linked to certain things. The municipalities have always said, okay, hey, if we do give out a permit, we need to make sure that the property or that the kind of like tenants do not cause any kind of like nuisance for the neighborhood, right? So sound insulation is super, super important. Fire safety, also very important. Communal areas, we want to make sure that you don't end up renting out a property that has like 10 6 square meter spaces. We want to make sure that it's also like a communal area. So that is an important one. And that every tenant has an individual contract. Also very, very important. So please be mindful of that. If you do decide to rent it out to multiple people, check in with your local municipality to see if the permit is required. I know that for the Amsterdam metropolitan area, it's required. And this is something that you might want to look into from a different perspective for Eindhoven, The Hague, and Groningen as well. Now, what is the ideal tenant? Of course, this depends on what you're actually looking for, right? Like I can't tell you what the ideal tenant for you is, but I can tell you there's a couple of things that are important to look out for. First, of course, is household, right? Are you okay with having a family? Are you okay with having a couple? Are you okay with having a single? Are you okay with having shares? That is important. Then pets, very, very important, because you want to make sure that your property is, or at least the contract states certain things about pets, right? Cats might be different perceived than dogs, than a goldfish. So we actually had a what is it, a giant African slug once. Very, very interesting. Luckily, didn't have that much impact on the house because it lived in a big aquarium. But it's good to be mindful of these things when you rent out your property. Income is also very important. We keep kind of like the rule of thumb where we say, as a tenant, you have to earn at least 3 times the rent on a monthly basis. So let's say your rent is 1,500 euros, right? Then as a tenant, you would need to earn at least 4,500 euros gross to actually be eligible for that property. Okay, if it's 4,400 euros, that's still perfectly fine. But once you like have a rent that's 1,500 euros and you make 3,000 euros, yeah, that's a big challenge. Why? Because we always consider like 1/3 goes up to tax. Well, the more you earn, more of course will go to tax. 1/3 is actually for rent, and 1/3 is for actually living your life. So that is something that is important for us. And of course, if it's 100 euros off, 150 euros off, that still could be perfectly fine, right? But the further that gap or the bigger that gap, the more likely is that the person will maybe find it challenging to actually pay for the rent. And again, from a sustainability perspective, you don't want somebody that just says yes to your property because they need something, right? And then quietly they got to look for something more affordable, and within 3 or 4 months they're out of the property, right? You want to again build a little bit long-term, a more long-term relationship with your tenant. Work contract also very important. We always look for people with at least a year contract or longer, and that have hopefully passed their probation period. That is not always the case, right? It's not always possible to say that because there's a lot of people looking that have just moved here. And I think it's fair to also be able to give them a property. And of course, there's some other things as well when it comes to your tenants, right? So, for example, maybe you have affinity to what they do, a little bit of background about them, right? What technically you can ask any question you want to ask. So don't hesitate. Just okay, like I would love to get to know my tenant a little bit better, and get a good feel for that person as well. So how well can they communicate? How responsible are they? Maybe do they have they ever lived in a rental place before? All these things can actually make a difference, and it's really up to you as well to get a good feeling for that. Now, the latest news. There's a couple of things. Everything is on the page at once. When it comes to kind of like the rules that have already kind of like been implemented for 2023, there's a couple of things. So this is a little bit financial. But technically, what I mentioned a little bit earlier is that a property that is rented out is technically considered worth a little bit less, especially when it comes to selling the property. However, the government says, okay, it's perfectly fine, but we see it as wealth, so we're not going to use the amount that you would otherwise pay as, or you would otherwise kind of like value the property as a evaluator or as a bank. We're not going to use that. We're going to increase that amount. So that is increased to 95%. Also, the taxable fictional yield. So the government technically just says, okay, hey, we're not going to look at like the yields on a case-to-case basis. We're just going to say we are going to assume that everyone has a certain yield over their property, and that number has increased versus last year. So that is up to 4.5%. Now, also, the mortgage can no longer be fully deductible from the actual taxable amount of your wealth. So it used to be the case that if you had, let's say, a property of 300,000 euros, right? And you still have the mortgage out of 150,000 euros, then you can deduct the full amount, 150,000 euros of the 300,000 euros. That is no longer the case. There's a little bit more of a complicated calculation around what you can deduct from the mortgage, but it's good to be mindful that they'll see kind of like the almost the full amount. I think it's about now like 80, 85 or 90%, the full amount of the value of the property as value that is actually taxable. Now, that has somewhat of an impact, right? Especially if you have like a property portfolio, it has an impact. If you have one property, then just have us do the calculation, and also for yourself, it's good to be mindful of that. Now, these are the 2023 rules and regulations. Let's have a look at the next year's regulations, because there will be some things that will change. The government has said, okay, hey, we need to be regulating the market a little bit more. And what is now missing from the rental market is a mid-segment. So like I mentioned before, is that when you have 149 points or more, so more than 149 points, then it's a private sector property. So it's deregulated. So you can charge anywhere above 808 euros if you want to, right? Then threshold 149 points and below that, like that's capped, but there's nothing in the middle. So it's not like there's anything that says, okay, hey, you're restricted to only charge 1,000 euros or 1,100 euros. So the government is trying to actually create this mid segment by saying, okay, we're going to increase the number of points that makes your property eligible to be deregulated. And for 2024, they're considering to raising it to 187 points. So what that means is that the bar from like 808 euros goes up to 1,026 euros, which equals then 187 points. Again, this is not kind of like confirmed yet, but they're talking about this, and it is likely that some of these rules and regulations for 2024 will actually be introduced. There's a lot of feedback and pushback from lobbyist parties, from real estate parties, and so on, because they're afraid that people will start selling their properties instead of anything else. Now, then there's also something that it's good to be mindful of, because the rent increase was always capped at inflation plus 1%. Well, little did they know that inflation would be around 10% last year. Nobody saw it coming, of course. So they want to have more control over that, and they want to actually start linking it to the general salary increase across the board in the Netherlands, and then increase that. Make sure that the rental increase is the amount of salary increase percentage plus 0.5%. Again, this is in talks, right? So it's not 100% confirmed yet. Also, what they want to do is, instead of saying that the WZ value accounts for 33% towards the value or the point system and the value of your property up until 149 points, they're actually going to link that to the increased 187 points. So also good to be mindful of that. And yeah, again, like I mentioned, the mortgage can no longer be deducted from the value of property for tax purposes. If you have any questions, please pop in the Q&A. Oh, I saw a question from Simar. Can VVE decline my request to rent out my apartment? So we don't often experience that they decline the request unless it's clearly stated in the bylaws that you can't rent out your property. What sometimes happens is that they want to know who's actually renting the property. So that's again, I've never experienced this happen, but sometimes it's stated in the bylaws or in the clause in the VVE agreements that they have the right to kind of like refuse a tenant, not so much to refuse the fact that you're renting it out. And if they get presented a tenant, and let's say, I don't know, it turns out that they have a criminal record or something like that, then they could say, okay, hey, we don't want to have the tenant in your property. Again, if you have a proper relationship with the VVE, you don't have to worry too much about that. There is a blank page here. We'll talk about the rental contracts. The rental contracts is super, super, super important, because this will give you flexibility, yes or no, when it comes to your property. Now, let's start off with rental contract. We call it Model A. The Model A contract is an indefinite rental contract. So it means that the tenant can stay for as long as they want. You, however, as landlord, can request a minimum term, right? So what we often see is that it's a Model A contract with a minimum of 12 months. This means that the tenant has to stay for a minimum of 12 months. Afterwards, the tenant has the right to terminate with 1 calendar month's notice. You, however, do not have that right? So the tenant has the protection to stay as long as they want. The notice period is equal to 1 payment period. So if you have agreed with the tenant that he pays 2 months in advance every time, then the notice period is 2 months. Often it's just 1 month. So then the notice period is 1 month. So that's a Model A contract. Now, we have a Model B contract as well. And a Model B contract is a temporary rental contract, which can actually last up to 24 months. You cannot request a minimum term, right? Because the upside for you as a landlord for Model B contract is that the tenant has to leave, or you can ask the tenant to leave after that maximum period ends. The tenant, they have no protection. Of course, you can't evict them during the rental property or during the rental periods. And the tenant has the right to give notice throughout the rental periods with 1 payment period notice, right? So often this is 1 month. The Model B contract cannot be extended. Well, it can be, but if it does, then it actually moves to a Model A contract per direct, right? So then the tenant has an indefinite contract, and he can stay for, or she or they can stay for as long as they want. Then we have a Model C contract. The Model C contract is often used for, or by landlords who are moving to another country temporarily, right? So again, it's a temporary contract up to 24 months. You can request a minimum term, however, with this one. You do have to state that you'll be returning to the property after your after the rental period expires, and you are able to extend with a similar term. So let's say you move to Singapore for your job, right? You get to work there for 12 months, and then your employer asks you to actually increase or extend your stay there for another 12 months. Then you have the right with this contract to extend the Model C contract with a similar term. The notice period is equal to 1 payment period. And if you have a minimum term, then the tenant cannot actually give notice in that minimum term. Now, what are your responsibilities? These are your responsibilities. So let's first focus on the minor and major repairs, right? So there's actually a document that has been created by the government that states, okay, as a landlord, you're responsible for this, like, for example, the structure of the building, the electrical equipment, all that stuff. As a tenant, you're responsible for fixing the minor and smaller things. I always kind of like use a rule of thumb. If it doesn't require a specialist and it costs you less than $50, then most likely it's the tenant's responsibility. I'm talking about light bulbs. I'm talking about doorknobs. I'm talking about stuff like that, right? The tenant also has a responsibility to make sure that there's no clogging of the toilets or the piping and so on, and making sure that when they do leave for a holiday in winter, that they don't turn off the radiators and close the radiators and turn off the heating system, because that can actually lead to some pretty terrible accidents there. We had one case where a tenant did that, and then they closed everything off, and then a pipe burst, and then the basement flooded up until kind of like here. It was very fascinating to see that. So that's the responsibility for the tenant. As a landlord, at the end of the period, so let's say you have a Model B contract, right, which is a temporary contract. The Model B contract, you have to kind of like give notice no sooner than 3 months and no later than 1 month when the period ends, right? So you still have to give notice, but you can't do it sooner than 3 months and no later than 1 month. Also, you have responsibilities towards the VVE, of course, so making sure that you help the tenant understand that they're moving into a house that's part of a VVE, and having them also sometimes sign the VVE documents is important. Taxation, of course, property tax, wealth tax, that is your responsibility. And registration. So make sure that the tenant actually registers, because if you deregister yourself from the property and the tenant doesn't register, then it's going to be vacant property. At some point, you'll get some questions from the municipality there. Now, I think that was it. Are there any questions? If so, pop them in the Q&A. We'll try and answer them as much as possible. And of course, please do not hesitate to reach out for an intake. We will, I think, send an email to you tomorrow or the day afterwards latest with a link to the actual webinar, and with a link to actually scheduling an intake with us. We're happy to answer any follow-up questions as well during the intake, maybe for more specific cases. So let's see any questions that you guys have. I see one question from Natalie, actually, Natalia, in the chat. I see a question about the vacant value ratio. What does this impact? This impacts the actual tax you'd have to pay. So the government says, okay, hey, when you rent out your property, there are certain kind of like calculations that we do to figure out what is the actual tax you would have to pay. So the vacant value ratio is important because it actually says something about the amount of tax that you would need to pay. I think the wealth tax right now it's about 6%, 6.13, I think. So this is important. If there are, oh, sorry, there's a lot of questions. I just need to scroll down. W, how are rent income taxed? So it depends a little bit. If you just have one property, so let me rephrase that. So we have different tax boxes, right? And different tax boxes technically means that we apply different rules to different types of income. Let's say you actually want to start becoming like a professional property manager, and you kind of like rent out multiple properties, and you do the management yourself, you do everything yourself, then technically they consider it more as a job, and it's more like box 1 versus box 3. But most of you will not remove or move your property from box 3, because box 3 is technically additional and more like wealth tax related, right? So the actual rent income is not taxed then, but the value of your property and so on is taxed, right? So this is where the vacant value ratio comes in play. This is where the perceived yields by the government comes into play, because they do tax that, but they don't tax kind of like your general rental income. Hope to answer your question a little bit, W. Another question from Anonymous. I have a resident mortgage with ABN AMRO and want to switch to a rental mortgage. How complicated is changing like that? So my suggestion would be have a chat with your mortgage advisor when it comes to this, because different mortgage providers apply different processes, right? Not all of the mortgage providers have a buy-to-let mortgage. I know ABN AMRO, I think they do have one. So how complicated is changing that? It's not super complicated, right? But my advice would be to get support on that, because I wouldn't necessarily go with your own bank when it comes to this, right? So you could actually consider maybe having a different mortgage with somebody else, and they would actually, there might be a fine for paying off your mortgage already a little bit, but or that really depends. So my suggestion would be talk to your mortgage provider or mortgage advisor, because they'll know the clauses that you've signed up for in your mortgage deed a lot better. I don't think it's very complicated. I think you can do it in a week or two, three, right? So it's not super complicated. Jordi Tambillo, is there any website to get an estimate for the point system? What I'll try and do is I'll see if we can actually add that to the newsletter we'll send out tomorrow or the day after. Yeah. So there's a website. Is it 100% accurate? No, it's not 100% accurate, right? Because I do think that there's some advice that you can actually get. So my suggestion would be try that first, right? See how close you are, and then my suggestion would still be to have like a proper point system counting being done if you wanna be 100% sure. So if I can't deduct the value of the mortgage from my taxes, will it still be worth it to make the investment in real estate? Yeah, I think it does, right? So I think that there's a couple of things, right? Do be mindful of how much you will actually be able to charge for your rental property, especially if you look at the 24 regulations, right? So it will be more of a calculation. So I would look into that. I do believe that it might still be worth it, right? Because don't forget, in the end, the tenant will actually pay off your mortgage. So what a lot of um, uh, um, homeowners do is they just look at kind of like the net result that they're having. But I don't think you should just technically look at that. I also believe you should look at, okay, so the mortgage is based on partly interest, partly principal, right? The principal is technically profit already, right? So have a look at that a little bit more specific. And there's still properties, there's still cities, there's still areas where you can have like a decent kind of like yield on your property. Again, it's not as attractive as it was like the last 10 years ago, but still attractive enough. But you still have to make that calculation, because I would advise to do it also before these regulations were introduced, right? And again, if you are able to rent out your property this year and a tenant stays for a year or 3 or 5 years, right? Then the kind of like current regulations apply. So it's not like that next year you suddenly have to change your rental income or your rental price if your tenant's already living in the property, right? So that's not the case. Hope that answers your question a little bit. And then Bota Giulia, sorry if I'm butchering any names. I'm trying to do my best. Last year we bought a new year build project with our help. However, unfortunately, our new build project in Eindhoven got very big delays due to the post-pandemic, or now the foreseen delivery is Q1 2024. Due to this, we decided to move to Amsterdam anyway and rent a place while waiting our new house in Eindhoven to be ready to move in. We also decided to rent out our apartment in Delft to be able to partially cover the expense of the expected rent in Amsterdam. We would like to understand how much taxes will we have to pay on our apartment in Delft. That is a very specific question, but Julia, and I would love to actually help you out with that, but I would need some more specific numbers. So my suggestion would be book an intake with us, right? And then bring some of the numbers to place, right? And then we can actually have a look at your tax calculation. Again, maybe also good to be mindful of that we are not fiscal specialists, right? So I can give you kind of like an estimation of what you would have to pay in taxes, but my suggestion would also be to actually have a chat with a fiscalist, because these guys have a broader picture of your kind of like tax identity. So my suggestion would also be to talk with them. Again, please be mindful that when you decide to rent out your property, you're technically becoming like a little small business, right? And I would approach it like that as well. So make sure you look at everything from a legal perspective, from a fiscal perspective, before you make that final decision. It's like sometimes it's done a little bit too flippantly, and then landlords find themselves in with questions that they don't know how to answer. So we're happy to help out with that, Julia, but we need a little bit more information around your property there. How we have to allocate our houses and mortgage. Box 1, box 3, when filing in your yearly tax declaration. Again, I think this is a question that is better answered one-on-one. My apologies, but I want to make sure that the time that we spend is also valuable for everyone else. Gary Hung, how to determine the market rent of my property? Good question, Gary. Look at comparable properties, right? So in the end, you want to have a price that is not too competitive, but also non-competitive, right? So we want to make sure you want to make sure that you look at kind of like what the market currently has to offer, right? Look at the differentiation of your property and base the value of that. Because in the end, if you go too low, it might be easily rent out, right? And you might have a tenant that might actually stay for a long time, but you might also be leaving money on the table. So it's a fine balance there. Christy, can we get a second mortgage just to buy a property to rent? Yeah, you can. You can. That will be then an investment mortgage or buy-to-let mortgage. Of course, they will look at kind of like the value of your property, of the property that you might want to buy, and actually the rental income that you could actually generate. And of course, they'll look at your liabilities outside. But I think that no, I know that you can, but my suggestion would be talk to a mortgage provider or mortgage advisor, because they'll be actually able to share a little bit more about what the different type of buy-to-let properties or property mortgages there are. Alessandro, I have two apartments, one with no mortgage that I will start renting out. The other is under construction, has a mortgage on it. Since this apartment is under construction, I am currently living in another apartment that I rent. Can I decide which of the two apartments goes in box 1 and which will go in box 3? So my consideration would be that they both would fall under box 3, right? You're not kind of like becoming kind of like doing this as a profession. So both would most likely fall in box 3, unless you start approaching it in a little bit different way. But again, my suggestion would be to talk with a fiscalist around this. The initial response would be they still would fall both in box 3. Vish Solanki, if two non-students are allowed, does it mean two families or only two persons? I think this has to do with what is allowed, who is allowed to rent the property. I think when they refer to two non-students, I think that the students part is the key here, right? So I think that they're looking for anything but students. So yes, it can be not two families, right? So it's most likely two people. So it can be a couple. So yeah, I don't think they're referring to two families here. Question from Natalia. Which type of contract do you recommend? Type C gives most freedom to the landlord, but what are the disadvantages of it? Why not everyone takes it? Yeah, so type C is technically only when you can actually prove that you actually are leaving the property for a temporary period of time and you'll be moving back in, right? If everybody just says, okay, hey, I'm just going to go for model C and I don't really have the intention to come back, right? Because I've bought something else in another country and I'm going to stay there indefinite, then it's not really allowed to use model C. And if the tenant would at some point objected, then yeah, you would have to go to court and say, okay, hey, sorry, but no, this is very clear. I'm only here temporarily and I'm moving back. So yeah, that's why not everyone is actually using Model C, because otherwise, yeah, the Model B would not be very relevant, right? So that's the case. Where to find out which houses are allowed to be rented out? Yeah, it's a good question. Technically, if you own a property that you've bought, right, you have the right technically to rent it out, but you need approval from the bank, and you also need to look at kind of like the municipality to see, okay, hey, do I have the right actually to rent this out? There's no public website that says, okay, you can fill in your zip code and it will actually be allowed, yes or no. Can we get a mortgage to buy land instead of a building? Actually, we think about some woods houses for Airbnb. I love that idea. Yeah, you then definitely get a mortgage to buy land instead of a building. That's perfectly fine. But again, the same logic applies to when you, for example, buy to let. Or well, in this case, I'm assuming you're going to use it as an investment, right? So the bank will probably want to have a little more detail about, okay, what are you going to use the land for? And what is actually going to be the return on investment on that, right? Based on that, they'll be able to say, okay, hey, we can grant this amount of mortgage or this, right? This probably required a little bit more work and effort from your end, because you would need to come up with a bit of a business plan around it, right? Whereas with a property, like you have an existing building and you can just look for, okay, so what can we rent it out? But in your case, I think you would have to construct something as well. And then if it's woods houses, then the actual comparables are maybe a little more difficult to find. Not impossible, right? But please have a look at that. The same thing applies, for example, when somebody buys land for building kind of like holiday homes or something like that. So it is definitely possible. Several news indicate that the rents have dropped down. Do you see this happening in big cities? How fast are properties being rented in average? So I think this really depends, right? I think that in some of the major cities, the prices have not dropped. So if you look at Amsterdam, even The Hague and Eindhoven, I don't see the prices drop. I think that the prices are dropping in the more rural areas, right? Because we're seeing that people are moving back into the cities again. Also, there's more properties on the market at the moment, right? Because properties are like being sold a little bit less fast than they were before. I do feel that there's going to be a turnaround next year where less properties will be on the rental market. So I foresee that the rental prices, most likely in the foreseeable future, next couple of years, will go up. Now, if I would be able to actually predict the future, I would probably be doing something else. But I do feel that kind of like with the new regulations, the amount, like the free sector, will shrink a little bit because, yeah, especially some of these big kind of like portfolio holders will maybe sell off parts of their properties, which means that there will be less properties for rent in the rental market. Now, also, we're seeing some developments in the buying market, right? Interest rates are going up and prices of properties are still quite high, right? So we're seeing that less people are actually available or able to actually buy properties, which means that there's more pressure on the rental market. I think that the rental prices will, especially in the bigger cities, will either remain this year or will actually increase the next coming years. Any further questions? If not, then I want to thank you for your time. And I want to wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And again, if you are keen to kind of like touch base with us one-on-one, don't hesitate to schedule an intake. We will send the webinar via email to you, and I will try and add the link to the point system as well, a calculation. Have a lovely day, everyone. Take care, stay warm in this weather, and hope to actually see you in person soon. Take care.